Into Star area in Anderson County, we have a shower just south of our camera here at Lake. A lot of sunshine, that's going to mean a lot of heat. We'll watch out for a few pop-up thunderstorms tomorrow, late afternoon, isolated, but where they develop could be strong to severe with gusty winds, lightning, and a little bit of hail.
We do have a lot more news coming up tonight.
I spelled length incorrectly. Legs.
Wet to dry, and that's going to mean some very hot temperatures in the forecast. That's all tonight at 11.
Eye on the Storm, Hurricane Season 2019.
Hey there and good evening. It's just after 8 o'clock. Welcome to Eye on the Storm for Wednesday, June 19th. This is your weekly in-depth look at the tropics and how it will impact you. I'm CBS 17 Chief Meteorologist Wes Hohenstein here in Raleigh, North Carolina. And joining me tonight will be other meteorologists from our family of Nexstar television stations up and down the East Coast. Look at all of them. Tonight, we will be visiting with meteorologists in Savannah, Georgia, the Norfolk, Virginia Beach area, and Spartanburg, South Carolina. Each week we'll focus on a different part of the East Coast, bringing you different stories and perspectives on the tropics. Our intention to provide you with the latest tropical information, whether there's a hurricane bearing down us or not. We'll be here throughout the entire 2019 Atlantic hurricane season. Of course, the season officially started June 1st. We haven't had any activity since subtropical storm Andrea formed and then dissipated May 20th and 21st, so almost a month ago. So let's start off tonight with kind of looking at the current conditions. Typically this time of year, we'll look in the Gulf of Mexico, we'll look in the Western Caribbean, we'll look around the Bahamas for things to form. Those are the areas in our world right now that have the warmest water, and that's one of the key ingredients. We do see a little thunderstorm activity off our East Coast. We see some thunderstorm activity east of the Caribbean, but right now there's really nothing that the National Hurricane Center is keeping an eye on. And, you know, that goes for the Pacific side, too. While the Atlantic side season started on June 1st, the Pacific side starts a little earlier. They started on May 15th. So we go to the other side of the country. We're looking out here in the Pacific. There's the West Coast. There's Mexico. Hawaii way over here, and you see some activity that's typical along the intertropical convergence zone, unorganized thunderstorm activity. I mean, that happens. Just because you have a thunderstorm doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have any activity, so nothing really that has us concerned right now. But listen, we have had early season tropical activity in our country's history. In fact, I want to take you back to 1966, Hurricane Alma. It is the earliest calendar year hurricane to ever hit the continuous 48 states. This is what the satellite picture looked like. Again, this is from 1966. I know it's really hard to read, especially considering the great graphics and satellite pictures we have today. So this is the Yucatan Peninsula. Over here is Cuba. And again, there is obviously Category 3 Hurricane Alma. So the statistics on this storm, the earliest calendar year hurricane on record to make landfall, and our records go all the way back to 1851. While it got as strong as a Category 3, it made landfall as a Category 2 along the panhandle of Florida and then kind of moved up the East Coast, doing what storms that move up the East Coast do, bringing us a lot of rain. So they happen this time of year. But we don't have anything going right now. But despite a calm Atlantic Ocean right now, we do have a history of tropical activity this time of year. So let's dive into that. Joining us from Spartanburg, South Carolina to talk more about that is Malachi Rogers. He is a meteorologist for WSPA Television. Malachi, the entire state of South Carolina, is under the threat of severe weather tomorrow, like us here in North Carolina. But when it comes to tropics, what do you guys normally see this time of year down there?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because you may get lulled into a sense of feeling like, well, it's hurricane season. It doesn't really peak until September or October. But we have to remind our viewers, we have to remind people in our area, our community, our Carolinas family, if you will, that these tropical systems can impact the Carolinas as early as May, June, and July. We take a look at where we are right now, the typical tropical storm formation. You can see the graphic here, and the arrow points to where we are right now between June 20th and July 10th. Very little activity, very low impact activity during that time of year compared to how it peaks around September the 10th. But that does not mean that we are free from any tropical systems. I mentioned this earlier, those formation zones, you'll notice several of these are along the South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida coastlines. And as those storms develop, it could easily make that left turn into the Carolinas to have a big impact on us during the month of June. During the month of July, again, that same area off the Carolina coastline, the Gulf of Mexico really starts to heat up, and we look a little bit farther out in the Caribbean as those storms have a tendency to form and then race up the East Coast. Here's what we're looking at. And again, we talk about the fact that this isn't the peak of hurricane season, it's just the beginning of it. But since 2000 up to last year, we have seen about 10 storms form during the months of May, June, and July. You may be surprised to see that more of them formed in May than in June or July. And the impact of those storms has been felt in the Carolinas. When storms come into the Carolinas, whether it's this time of year or in the peak of hurricane season, but again, we have to remind people this time of year, this can have a major impact. Heavy rain, flooding, gusty winds, and tornadoes are what we see in the upstate. As you move up in elevation, as you move up in terrain, we start talking about about the mountains, we're tracking heavy rain, high winds, flooding that can cause landslides. And again, that's a big danger in western North Carolina. The topography of South Carolina has a lot to do with that, South and North Carolina. We are about 175 miles from the coast to our viewing area. So as people are watching us, we pay close attention to those storms. And although they will weaken as they move over land, those storms can typically still pack a punch as they move into the Carolinas. If you don't believe it, just look at the history of Hurricane Hugo that hit about 30 years ago in Charleston and tracked up the center of South Carolina. When you get into the topography, though, we go from elevations of close to maybe 100 feet above sea level. In western North Carolina, we can peak to over 2,000 feet above sea level. And anytime you get rain, that rain gets funneled into those valleys. That's a big cause for a lot of flooding in localized areas. So as we're talking about hurricane season and tropical seasons this time of year, flood safety is something we have to emphasize when we're talking to our viewers, talking to our Carolinas family, because that's a big concern. Don't drive through standing water. Go to higher ground and really seek out those spaces that are safer and drier as you're talking about tropical systems. And we've been impacted by these systems. Last year, Tropical Storm Alberto, just a tropical storm, but because of that path, we were on the right side of that storm, which is always, as we know, the most active side of a tropical system. We saw heavy rains. You can see that bullseye of red over like Asheville into the northern parts of South Carolina, even some moderate rain into Greenville and Spartanburg. We saw a couple of other systems as well, Florence and Michael, and we talked a lot about these, had the biggest impact on the coast, but because most of our viewing area stayed on the right side of that storm, when Florence made landfall and tracked slowly across the Carolinas, it dumped a lot of rain along the coastal areas near Conway, but some of that heavy rain also made its way into the upstate and the mountains. And of course, Michael, as that storm came through, it also had an impact on the Carolinas. Again, more of the activity was to our south, but we still got a glancing blow from a tropical system. And again, flooding is the concern along the coastal areas. This is just kind of an example of what we're talking about when we look at drainage basins and how much that rainwater falls in. We're talking 2 to 4 feet of flood water in these areas, and many of these cities were flooded out as we took a look at what was going on last year with Florence. As we take a look at Michael, I showed you earlier, didn't even have a direct impact in the upstate. We were on the weaker side of that storm, but we still experienced widespread power outages because of those gusty winds and the slick siding and landslides that we experience because of so much rain. So again, as we're talking about hurricanes this time of year, preparation is the key. We want to make sure people don't let their guard down because, again, most folks are geared up when you're talking about hurricane season in September, in October. That's where you see the biggest, heaviest, most active storms typically. But in the first of the hurricane season, the beginning of the season, the May, the Junes, the Julys even, when people are more thinking of vacations and going to the beach, you still have to be prepared because as you see here in the Carolinas, we can still see those impacts. Even as far inland as we are in the Carolinas, in the upstate and western North Carolina, preparation is going to be the key. And again, as we go through the next couple of weeks, even into the next month or two, one of the things that we are going to emphasize to our viewers is the fact that preparation is the key. You don't want to wait until the last minute to have a flood plan. You don't want to wait until the last minute to have a hurricane plan either, because when we issue these, you may be on vacation or you may be getting the kids from school or from camp or something like that. You want to be prepared for that as soon as it happens. So again, preparation is the key across the Carolinas, and really just the awareness of the fact that we have these systems taking place, we have these storms in our area, and again, the fantastic idea that we have these 3, 5, even 7 days advance notice of where these storms are going. With that forecast cone, we can do a much better job of helping people kind of prepare for hurricanes or tropical systems even this early in the year.
Yeah, Malachi, I want to get back to Alberto because it was just about a year ago that Tropical Storm Alberto that you were just talking about was hitting the Carolinas, and you guys in your area had that horrible accident that led to the death of 2 television reporters. What were those conditions like when that accident happened, and kind of remind us all what did happen?
Yeah, exactly. Unfortunately, a reporter and a photographer from one of our stations in the Carolinas actually lost their life as a tree was pushed over from a landslide, and that was a result of days of rain that we saw just as the remnants of Alberto worked its way into the southeast. The path of Alberto actually was interesting because it was still well to our west, but it pulled up a lot of moisture, and we saw about 3 to 4 days of heavy rain across the upstate and western North Carolina. And as we're talking about the topography, and I showed you the map of the valleys and peaks in North Carolina and those mountains, a lot of that rain that we saw from Alberto just kind of funneled into some valleys and low-lying areas. So the reporter and the photographer were actually covering the flooding that was taking place as a result of Alberto. And unfortunately, when you're talking about areas like that that are wet, that have been slick, that have experienced so much rain, a deluge of rain over several days, it makes the ground very susceptible to landslides. And unfortunately, what happened was a tree was caught up in that landslide and fell on the vehicle. And unfortunately, those two young men lost their lives. So again, we talk about the fact that a storm doesn't have to be a direct hit. We tell people that all the time, that although we are forecasting a storm maybe 100 miles to our east or 100 miles to our west, we don't want folks to just look at that center. You want to look at the entire mass of that storm, where those bands expand to, where the rain is, where those heaviest gusty winds are, because any of those elements can lead to disaster. We're talking flooding, landslides, and again, power outages that could cause very damaging results for a lot of people. As we saw, because of that system, because of the rain that was in place, because of Alberto, we saw flooding in those spots.
Yeah. That is tough stuff. And Malachi, thanks so much for walking us through some early season storms. Again, that's Malachi Rogers. He's at WSPA in Greenville-Spartanburg in western South Carolina. He also covers the western part of North Carolina. So let's talk about some more early season hurricanes. So let's get back to the big board. You know, we ask you guys for some questions, and I'll be honest with you, these are a lot of the more popular questions I get when I visit schools every day. You know, when we're in a kind of a lull in the hurricane season, people want to know the worst, the most expensive, the deadliest. So I want to take a second, and even though it's the middle of June, I want to talk about some of the hurricanes that have been the worst for our country. And remember, when we're talking about our historical context, our records are really solid back to about 1851. So let's look at first the strongest hurricanes. These are just period, not to impact the United States or to hit the Caribbean. These are the strongest hurricanes ever measured on the Atlantic side by wind speed. Okay, the strongest was back in 1980. Hurricane Allen had winds almost, if you think about it, 200 miles per hour, 190. Second was Irma, and we all remember that just a few years ago. Brushed the coast of Florida and the East Coast, 185 miles per hour. Wilma in 2005 was just as strong with 185. So was Gilbert in 1988, and the Florida Keys hurricane back in 1935, before we started using names, boy, girl, names to represent all cultures where hurricanes impact. They didn't really have names, so you gave them names based on where they impacted. So those are the strongest hurricanes, period. What about the strongest hurricanes to make landfall? So these names might sound familiar too, especially in recent history. I'll start with the strongest, and that was the Labor Day hurricane back in 1935. Winds were 185 miles per hour. Camille hit Mississippi, Louisiana area back in 1969, 175. Andrew in 92, that hit Florida. Michael in 2018, last year's Michael, the fourth strongest hurricane ever to make landfall in the United States, 160 miles per hour. And Charlie back in 2004, that was one of the first storms I ever covered. That's tied for fifth. We have a long list of storms that have had 150 mile per hour winds. So a few of those storms I just showed you are a few of the only Category 5 hurricanes to ever impact our country. So there have only been 4 in recorded history. Labor Day in 1935, Camille, Andrew, and Michael. 3 of the 4 hit Florida. So Florida, unfortunately, one of the more popular spots to get really bad hurricanes. You know, most of these hurricanes, though, have happened later in the season and have not necessarily happened in the middle of the season. So let's kind of dive into that subject a little more. And for that, we're going to go up the coast a little to the Norfolk, Virginia Beach area and welcome in Jeff Edmondson. He is a meteorologist at Wavy Television. Jeff, it doesn't always work out that the biggest and baddest storms happen right in the middle of the season or in the middle of the summer. Kind of talk to us a little bit about that from Virginia.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Wes. The big thing is all about the delay and how we can warm up those ocean sea surface temperatures. Just looking at the graphic, we showed you this earlier in the broadcast. There's a little bit of a delay. We think of the hottest times of summer being in July and August. Well, the hottest times in the ocean are not in July. They're more so into the month of September, that peak statistically around the 10th of September. So when we look outside, this is our view here. This is not too far away from our studios if you're from the area and you know this area. This is the 15th Street, Virginia Beach. This view here, courtesy of surfline.com. You can see folks walking along the beach because the water temperatures, they're getting nice. I've been out in the water surfing. It's warming up. So we have a key ingredient. The water temperatures are warming up. They're in the low 70s. Makes it a lot more pleasant if you are out and about and you want to go to the beach and enjoy the water. But for hurricanes, they need warmer water than that. So how do we measure that? Well, it's an old-fashioned way. We just use buoys, kind of like this one here. This is taken from the National Data Buoy Center. If you were to Google that and look and see the data directly, it's actually kind of fun to see. But before I geek out too much about buoys, this is what they kind of look like. There's more than 1,000 across the world. There's several of them along the coastline in the Atlantic, some in the Caribbean. There are some further out to sea too, like this one here in the picture. They measure the same thing that a weather station does at the airport or maybe even in your backyard if you have one. The air temperature, the air, and also the water temperature, which is key. Wind direction, wind speed, wind gusts, and also the atmospheric pressure so we can see how low the pressure is inside the storm if it passes right over where one of these buoys are. Now, we could use more buoys across the ocean. There's not enough. But for the ones that we have, we can see what they kind of contribute to the formation of a hurricane. So what do you need? Well, first of all, you need those ocean temperatures to be at or above 80 degrees Fahrenheit for the surface temperature and also a depth down into the ocean, because as the hurricanes spin and churn over the ocean, they can really create those big waves and they churn in where that deeper water is. That provides the heat and the energy inside the storm. So how deep do you want that? Well, at least 50 meters deep. Basically, about the length of a jumbo jet down into the water, if you want to imagine how deep that is, 160 feet or so for that depth. But deeper, the better. For at least hurricanes, not for us. Now, where do you want that and where is it happening now? Well, there's a few pockets in the central Atlantic that are already starting to warm up. I can show you that here. Here's a look at those sea surface temperatures, and these are from all those buoys I just showed you a picture of. We do have a few out in the Atlantic, and some are also close to Bermuda, too, near the islands where we get those temperatures where we can easily have buoys, because it's kind of hard to put a buoy out in the middle of the Atlantic where the water's so deep it can't be anchored. They'll just drift away. So that's what we have. That's why we're kind of missing some data here, but we can also use satellite data too to measure what the water temperature is. That helps us out to create a clear picture. And you can see a lot of areas where the ocean is nice and warm. But how deep is that warmth? Well, we can estimate that here with the ocean heat energy. Very low right now. If you look at the scale here, not exactly high. We're not in peak territory at all. I showed you that on the hurricane peak chart. As we get into September, we'll see more oranges, browns, reds on this graphic here. So that's where we are now. If we go to other spots in the world, you can see where there is more of that energy, but that doesn't bother for us. That doesn't matter for us. But I just wanted to show you that comparison. So once again, the peak of hurricane season typically in early to mid-September, even really essentially into August, late August, and then going into the middle of October is when we see the peak season. Here we are now in mid to early September. This compares to basically what it would be like in early November, so we don't typically see a lot of hurricanes this time of year. We showed you kind of that list of when we do have some of those early season storms. But how do you heat up the ocean? Well, of course, you need the sun. We don't have a bunch of water heaters set out in the ocean. We have to have the sun. The sun heats up the land and the ocean. The land heats up faster, of course. That's why our summer comes a little bit sooner. For the summer for the ocean, for all the sea life, that comes a little bit later. It needs more energy to heat up and cool down. To get that warm ocean, you need a delay, essentially. So that's why the hurricane development is a little bit later on. And to get deep into the science here, I figured I'd put an equation out for you to see how much energy does it take 1 liter of water, essentially. So for your water heater, this is essentially the equation. The ocean is a lot bigger than a liter, of course, but if you just want to relate that, that is the kind of number. So L is liters, T is a difference in temperature. If you warm it up 20 degrees, so then you add that, you kind of get the idea. So there's complex math involved with heating up the ocean. It's a really complex thing, but if you want to compare heating up the ocean compared to heating up a small pond, especially if you live in a colder climate, well, of course, heating up the ocean takes a lot longer than a pond where it can warm up really in a matter of a few weeks. Now, some of your questions that I've been seeing on Twitter from one person here, is there anything different about the weather patterns for this season coming up and anything that we need to watch for? Well, for right now, it's kind of hard to tell with the patterns that we have for the upcoming hurricane season, but we have a couple things that we can watch for where that Bermuda high sets up. That can change the possible path on where these hurricanes go, if they stay out to sea, if they go up the Atlantic coast, or possibly if they go into the Gulf of Mexico. A lot of factors involved with that, but that's what we're watching for right now, and that's what I would watch for as we go into the next couple of months. Now, another one from Twitter. Has there ever been a direct hit on Hampton Roads? Hampton Roads, if you're not familiar with this area, this kind of whole region, Virginia Beach areas, Eastern Shore of Virginia, this is kind of the Hampton Roads areas of Virginia. That's the nickname for it. And have we had a direct hit? Well, kind of yes and no. We, of course, had Isabel in 2003, and we also had a storm system in 1933 that made landfall in Nags Head, and the eye of the storm went right over Norfolk. So, yes, we have had storms make a direct hit. Are we overdue? Well, I hope not, but that's where we are right now. Showing you our view outside here. This is from our tower cam. There's the Elizabeth River where the water temperature is in the 80s, but remember that water temperature matters where it needs to be into the ocean and not so much for small areas of water, because the hurricanes need the ocean to stay strong, not a small lake, because once they get over land, they typically and usually do weaken. That's kind of the explainer there, a little bit of science. I hope that equation didn't throw anyone off, but we'll send it back to you, Wes.
Yeah, Jeff, you said there'd be no math tonight. We already did our homework. Good stuff. Hey, I want to ask you while we have you, I know you have been up there a long time. You were around covering Hurricane Sandy in 2012, and that's unfortunately a headliner. Tell us your experiences in covering Sandy. It's been, what, 2012 since Sandy hit?
Yeah, 2012. Well, the storm did affect our Outer Banks, a part of North Carolina that sticks right out into the ocean. So there was some damage there, but essentially we didn't have too much of an impact from that. Of course, we were on the air the whole time during the thing, but a lot of flooding, a lot of heavy rain, that was the main impact. We did have some high wind gusts, but the main impact was further to our north.
All right, good stuff. Beautiful night up there in Virginia. Again, as up in Norfolk and really all across the East Coast, we're all preparing for a severe weather threat tomorrow. Jeff will be covering that with the rest of his team at WAVY Television, Wavy TV up in Norfolk, Virginia. Jeff Edmondson, thanks for hanging out with us tonight. Let's get into one more thing about the June Atlantic tropical season formation. Got a great graphic here that kind of just summarizes where we need to watch out for this time of year. This is from Dr. Phil Klausbach, one of the best meteorologists in the world at Colorado State University. He has plotted up all the June Atlantic named storm formation since 1851 through last year. Obviously, this year we don't have really any data, but if you just kind of step back and take a first snapshot of this graphic, I mean, where is everything happening? I mean, it's all happening right in those zones we've been talking about. So your kind of color coordination here, green is a tropical storm, category 1 or 2 hurricane in blue, and red is category 3, 4, or 5, a major. So two things I noticed. Number one, there's a lot of green. So this time of year, we're usually looking at a lot of tropical storms. Okay, very little blue and red. And look where they are. That's the other thing that sticks out to me. They're in those few spots that we talked about where the water is warmest this time of year. Around the Bahamas, in the Gulf of Mexico, and in the western part of the Caribbean. Now, one thing you'll notice as we go throughout July and August and September, these dots start to fan out a lot more farther to the east as the water and the upper air currents continue to impact that. So I love showing this graphic because it just does a great, simple job, like Google. What's the great thing about Google? Google.com, their webpage is So basic, right? In fact, people complain about that sometimes. This is such a simple graphic that does a great job of showing us where we need to watch out for this time of year. Now, preparation, as Jeff and everyone else has talked about, is key ahead of the Atlantic hurricane season. And as we head into the 2019 season, you may be wondering what you can do to protect your home. Well, CBS 17 meteorologist Paul Hagen reports that where the engineers at the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety come in.
Fran, Floyd, Matthew, Florence. Memorable storms that did substantial damage in North Carolina. And as we head into the 2019 hurricane season, you may be wondering what you can do to protect your home. That's where the engineers at the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety come in.
We study buildings to figure out how do we make them stand up to what Mother Nature brings.
And they do that by recreating the worst that Mother Nature brings. Fans powered by 350 horsepower motors blow apart houses, so researchers can evaluate how to strengthen construction. It's simple things that can make a big difference. Extra nails, metal straps that tie your house to its foundation, and strengthening your roof.
Starting at the ground level, the roof is actually the most important piece of your house. And so first and foremost, get that roof right.
You also want to evaluate your house's openings.
You want to have a wind-rated garage door. You want to have shutters for those windows. It's absolutely a vulnerability that needs to be taken care of.
So this wall of fans draws enough electricity to power a small town. That's what it takes to produce 120-mile-an-hour winds, the same speed as a Category 3 hurricane or an EF2 tornado. Of course, in central North Carolina, it's not just wind that we have to worry about with hurricanes, it's water.
If your shingles get ripped off by the wind, what you've got here is like your colander in your kitchen. These holes just allow huge amounts of water to come in.
To prevent that, make sure you know what you're looking for when it's time to re-roof your house.
You want to make sure that your roof is capable of resisting those big soakers of rain like we saw in Florence. So what we have here is actually 2 layers of felt with a really good nailing pattern.
If you happen to be in the market for a new house, there's a specific phrase to look for when it comes to stronger construction.
So people who are looking for stronger housing need to look for fortified. So the pieces and parts that you see here on this wall, this is part of fortified gold.
Of course, most of us aren't buying a new house or replacing the whole roof anytime soon. You don't have to be an architect or structural engineer to do a quick assessment of your home's current readiness. Go up into your attic, get into your crawl space, and just take a look around.
Just a little visual inspection can tell you if things are looking good and orderly or if you need to call in a professional.
And if another hurricane threatens North Carolina, there's an extra step you can take before the storm hits.
Close all of your interior doors. It's like compartmentalizing everything so that if one window does happen to break, you've contained Mother Nature to that one small room and you haven't invited her into the entire house.
Throughout hurricane season, we'll be here to keep you ahead of the storms. For the CBS 17 Storm Team, I'm meteorologist Paul Hagen.
And Paul Hagen is our morning meteorologist here in Raleigh, North Carolina. We can all hope that we can go several years without seeing another destructive storm approach the Carolinas. Always better, though, to be prepared. Hey, this is a live look from Hilton Head Island down in South Carolina. We were scheduled to hear from, there it is, our friends at WSAV, but they are having a few technical problems, although I'm not 100% convinced that's not them right there playing tetherball. Never a bad day at the beach, right? Of course, that saying might not be true when there is a hurricane coming. Listen, that is going to do it for tonight's edition of Eye on the Storm. Remember, we will be right here every Wednesday night at 8 o'clock talking hurricanes until the season ends at the end of November. Each week, we will have different stories and different perspectives on the 2019 Atlantic hurricane season. So thank you so much for spending some of your night with us live in Raleigh, North Carolina. I'm Chief Meteorologist Wes Hohenstein. Good night.